So, as it says on the tin, what I'm going to try to do is to give you the big picture on what we can say about this period in Highland Region. Then I'll come back to the gaps in our knowledge and we'll try to suggest ways of filling them. Highland, as you all know, covers a very large geographical area, and its Neolithic archaeology is fascinating, and yet it has suffered from the same problem as besets its tourist industry. In their thinking and their researches, many archaeologists tend to motor through it on the way to its more spectacular neighbour to the north, Orkney, thereby overlooking its treasures. The shining exceptions to this are, of course, Andy Hill, yes, and John Palmer, and before them, Audrey Henshaw for her magisterial work on chamber tombs, which sets the excavations of John Corcoran in the 1960s and of those of the 19th century antiquaries in context. We should also remember the survey work done by Roger Mercer in the 1970s and the useful palaeoenvironmental work that's being done, some of it as part of Rod McCulloch's Laird project in the 1980s and 90s, and no doubt Scott Timpany will be able to update us tomorrow on whether or by how much this coverage has changed since this map was published in 1998. And while there has been far less developer-funded excavation in Highland than in other parts of Scotland, nevertheless there have been some significant Neolithic finds, especially around Inverness. And here I'm thinking of all the work done at Culduffel, and now on the Inverness West Link road development. And long before that, Derek Simpson's rescue excavation of the Grooved Ware house and calcolithic Cladh Aindreis at Maesmawr. And while we're at it, we shouldn't forget Anne McSween's excavations at the Middle Neolithic settlement at Kinbeachy on the Black Isle, and the Middle to Late Neolithic settlement at Milton of Leeds. And of course, let us celebrate the key contributions made by community archaeology, as in the Adopt a Monuments project to rehabilitate the passage tomb at Cairn Glass at the southern end of the Black Isle. And Roland as one of the key players in that to congratulate. What we can now add to the mix is the brand new results, hot off the machine, of DNA analysis of 8 of Neolithic individuals from Highland, which demonstrates that they are indeed genetically distinct from the genetic makeup of British Mesolithic individuals, including one from Knockcoy on Oronsay. So in answer to the question about where the Mesolithic people are, there are about 76 disarticulated human bones on the Oronsay shell minerals. We've done isotopic analysis on some of these. They had a strongly marine diet, and this affects the way that you have to calibrate the radiocarbon dates, but it sounds as if they were contemporary with the earliest farmers. Now they've got the DNA, it's like the holy grail. They've got it for one individual from Knockcoy, and he falls within the blue group that matches him with other Mesolithic hunter-gatherer populations and sets him aside from the Neolithic farmers. And thus, the farmers must represent descendants from an immigrant population on the continent, so they're bringing in a completely new genetic signature. Yes, folks, farming was introduced to Britain and Ireland by immigrant groups from France. And in addition, there are new radiocarbon dates that were done to accompany that DNA work, and others that have been obtained from human remains within the last 20 years. And I'm showing them here. These join the other dates that had previously been done on human and animal remains and charcoal prior to 2000, and also other post-2000 dates that have been done on material other than human bone. So what can we now say about the Neolithic in Highland? Well, as far as beginnings are concerned, it's clear, well, first of all, it's clear that this represented a radical change in lifestyle. So no matter how little we know about what they were doing in the late Mesolithic, they sure were not milking cows, eating sheep, or eating cereals, all of which would have had the domesticated cattle and sheep and domesticated pigs and cereals, all physically imported from the continent. This part of Scotland was touched by both of the strands of Neolithisation, the ones with the red arrows that I've identified for Scotland as a whole. That is the so-called carinated bowl Neolithic, coming up from the Nord-Pas-de-Calais region of France, and the Breton Atlantic strand. Although apparently you don't get the very earliest manifestations of either of these strands in Highland Region. The carinated bowl Neolithic is represented by finds of what we call modified carinated bowl pottery from 7 sites including Camster-Long and Tulloch of Assery B, where it predates the construction of the tombs, and also from settlement contexts at Culduffel and Tornagrain in Inverness, and also on Canna, thanks to the National Trust, among other places. In the fine spots on the east side of the Highland region, it's of what Audrey Henschel called the northeast style of modifying carinated bowl pottery, which developed very rapidly from the very earliest kind of carinated bowl pottery that we find in Britain, perhaps within a generation or so of the farmers arriving from northern France, as we know from the date of assemblage at Balbrigdy Hall in Aberdeenshire. While on Canna, what we see is a localised and much later variant that dates through about 3,300 to 3,000. But this stuff we're talking about probably in the 38th century BC. Another sign of the carinated bowl Neolithic is a small number of Alpine jadeitite axeheads that have been found. And interestingly, a broken and burnt fragment was found here in Inverness in the railway stores of all places. And like several other Alpine axeheads, it had been deliberately killed, that is, broken and burnt, in order to return it to the world of the gods. And the source of these is the North Italian Alps, so Monte Viso. Note too how several of the fine spots lie along Loch Ness, along the Great Glen. These tend to echo the distribution of carinated bowl pottery in Scotland. Another feature of the carinated bowl Neolithic is the Clyde cairn at Cladh Aindreis on the Ardnamurchan Peninsula, which lies at the northern end of the distribution of this particular type of monument, which is characteristic of southwest Scotland and Northern Ireland, and represents a regionally specific translation into stone of the non-megalithic format that was brought to Britain. 5 dates from human bone from this particular site, Cladh Aindreis, indicate that it was in use by around 3,700 or 3,600 BC, if not slightly earlier. And more generally, the use of long cairns rather than round cairns is part of the carinated bowl Neolithic tradition. The second of these strands of Neolithisation, the Atlantic Breton tradition, is represented by passage tombs which have round cairns. And again, we're not necessarily dealing with the very earliest appearance of this strand of the Neolithic in Highland Region. For that, you have to look at Acham near Oban, and the handful of other closed chambers and simple passage tombs in the west. We can say from the Breton comparanda for the design of the Acham monument and the late Castellic-style Breton pottery there, that this distinctive strand of the Neolithic will have appeared sometime between 4,300 and 3,900 BC, possibly around 4,000. What we have in Highland seems to relate to the subsequent northeasterly expansion of this architectural tradition, and this is also seen in the Northern Isles. This secondary expansion of Neolithic things and practices from Western Scotland is likely to relate to an increasing population in the West as farming communities prospered and grew in the pockets of good agricultural land. And as for when this expansion happened, we have the dates from human remains in passage tombs to give us termini antiquos for the construction of these tombs. And these too suggest that this spread could have been as early as the late 38th century BC. And I would wager that the earliest passage tombs to be built in Highland were of this simple form, from which this is just a slightly scaled up version of the Ardnamurchan simple passage tomb. And thereafter you get more elaborate forms. And in northeast Highland, we can see a fascinating interplay of both the carinated bowl and the Atlantic traditions, neatly encapsulated at Camster-Long, where 2 passage tombs with round cairns were built, probably one before the other. I would wager the simple one before the complicated one. And then people covered them both by incorporating them under a massive horn cairn, which represents an aggrandized form of the earlier carinated bowl Neolithic longland format, as seen to the south of Highland. There was also an episode of activity that featured this modified carinated bowl pottery underneath the long cairn, but we can't say whether that predated all of the monument building tradition activity here. And Camster-Long is not the only multi-phase site where a passage tomb with a round cairn was engulfed within a long horned cairn. You can see it at Tulloch and Chonnoch as well. And here you can see where the round cairn of the passage tomb was first of all engulfed within a short horned cairn, and then they kind of pimped my monument. They put it under a huge one. What we see here is a huge investment in acts of conspicuous consumption. So people were rebranding Atlantic passage tubes with a carbonated bold cultural identity, if you want to look at it like that. And then there will have been an element of competition in this process, who could see who could honour their ancestors in the most impressive manner. As for when this process of aggrandizement took place, we can look to Clyde in Orkney for clues, since this monument that was built de novo was built as de novo as a longhorn cairn, and the dates from Point of Cott suggest that it was in use by the 37th century BC. If you look at the overall distribution of chamber cairns in Highland, there's a clear clustering around the coast and in valleys, in areas where cultivable land was available, with none in the more mountainous areas. And it's more than likely that this offers us a proxy evidence for patterns of settlement, although it doesn't tell us the whole story, as we know that there was a Neolithic presence in areas where chamber tombs are either absent or sparse, as on Rum from Caroline's excavations ages ago, or in areas of West Mainland examined by her and by Karen Hardy as part of Scotland's first settlers project. And on Skye, where there are a few chamber tombs, there's also evidence that Neolithic people also used the rock shelter at cairn as a place to bury their dead, thereby continuing a tradition of non-monumental burial as seen in the Oban caves, especially at Rascally, where incidentally the DNA analysis that have just been done have identified one example of a person, a farmer, who had intermarried with a hunter-gatherer there. The Palaeoenvironmental evidence suggests that inland, around Lairg, there was some forest clearance from around 3600 BC, and this may reflect an expansion inland of farming communities at that time. Another key point to be made about the early Neolithic in Highland is that this region was closely linked with Orkney from the get-go. We can say this because a modified carbonated bowl of Henschel's Gothic style has been discovered by Colin Richards in Orkney and Vestrafjord. And the design of the so-called Orkney-Cromarty-Hebrides passage tubes shows a sharing of this particular architectural tradition across the Pentland Firth. And indeed, it may well be that Orkney was colonised by farming groups who originated in Caithness. And these links persisted over the subsequent centuries, as we can see from the fact that some of the passage tube chambers look very much like the small stalled cairns with round cairn, small stalled chambers with round cairns that you find in Orkney, as you can see on the right. And also in the fact that large horn cairns and short horn cairns are shared across eastern Highlands and Orkney. As I said before, they seem to restate an affiliation to the carbonated bowl Neolithic tradition. And while the example of Camsterlong and several other Caithness sites represents an act of aggrandizement of pre-existing monuments, the Point of Cott one was built from scratch with a stalled chamber. And here you can see, again, this shared distribution of these long mounds and how it unites Highland with Orkney in a commonality of practice sometime around the 37th century, we think. The strong and enduring links with Orkney are also reflected in the close similarities in the trajectory of Neolithic pottery development in these two regions. You can see it in Unston bowls, which seem to have originated in northeast Scotland as early as the 38th century, and then spread up to Orkney and across to the Hebrides. You can also see it in the other round-based pottery, including impressed pottery and plain vessels that date within the 3600 to 3000 BC bracket. And it's also clear that the early to Middle Neolithic inhabitants of Highland interacted among themselves and with people beyond the region to the south, with Loch Ness seeming to be a major routeway. That's clear, for example, from the sharing of this specific variant of modified carbonated gold pottery from one end of the Great Glen to the other. And it's also reflected in the distribution of imported axeheads of porcelainite from Northern Ireland, from Tibulia and Brockley, which may have travelled up Loch Ness from southwest Scotland. And interestingly, at Sheridan, Lewis, you find a very rare example of a surviving axe haft, and the axe head there is of porcelainite from our country. Very yarn-like. And also, there is one possible example of an import from Great Langdale in Cumbria. This rather scrubby-looking reused axe head flake from Goldsby. But as you can see from the map, this is effectively beyond the main distribution of imports from Cumbria. Although let's not forget that some Langdale tuff did make it to Ness of Brodgar in Orkney during the late Neolithic. that I'm glad Susan, what you said this morning about stone axeheads. Yes, we need to go back, look at all of the stone axeheads that have ever been found in Highland, get the interpretation group to see if we can identify what the raw material is. So is this, is it the case, as we suspect, that they were using overwhelmingly local resources? Probably not. We can also say that people continue to be buried in Orkney, Cromarty, Hebrides passage tombs through the second half of the 4th millennium, and possibly into the 3rd, before some were subsequently reused during the early Bronze Age. So much for the early to Middle Neolithic. What about Late Neolithic developments? Clearly, there was nothing to compare with the Baroque explosion of monument building and creativity that we see in Orkney from around 3200 BC. Creativity that included inventing a whole new monument type, the stone circle, and probably timber circles as well. Plus, the enormous temple complex, as it were, at Maesmawr-type. And they invented a wholly new style of pottery, Grooved Ware. And they used a wide range of prestigious weapons and jewellery, which acted as weapons of social exclusion, as well as actual potential weapons. I see one of the stickets is what were cast stone balls used for? Well, there are skulls of Neolithic individuals in Orcadian tombs that have depressed blood fractures in them. You could bash people on the head with these things, but you could also use them as weapons of social exclusion. So I've got one of these, and that one on the hand grenade one is mine, and the numbly ball one is Jill's, and that one is yours, Susan. They individualise them, yeah? But only the elite would have these things. Okay? So, the people of Highland were by no means unaware of what was happening in Orkney, and they did participate in some aspects of what's going on. They must have gone to see and join in the midwinter festivities held at and around the nest of Brodgar, Maesmawr, and the Stones of Stoness. The one for the Christmas markets there. We can see this because there have been a few finds of grooved ware in Highland, including this rather scrubby-looking assemblage from Freswick Sands, where there are applied pellets on the pots, plus a finer and bigger assemblage from the Inverness ring road work. And before I leave this slide, Mike Copper is doing a fantastic HES-funded project at the moment on dating mainland Scotland grooved ware. Fabulous project. And from Raidmore, there was a slightly larger assemblage of what looks to be a rare mainland example of a late Neolithic house that was excavated by Derek Simpson. He's got new dates from Raidmore, I can't share them. It's also found at Milton of Leys, where this jar at the top with vertical cordons seems to have been a secondary insertion into a Middle Neolithic settlement site. So this pot almost certainly does not date as early as the charcoal from the same pit that produced a date between 3300 and 2900 BC. And it's most likely to constitute residual material from the Middle Neolithic settlement. So that date bracket, 3329, is fine for the pottery at the bottom, but not the pottery at the top, or this particular style of grooved ware. And I thank Mike for letting me use his distribution map. It's also clear from the presence of this mace head, the one on the left, and the oblique flint arrowheads of black flint that were found in the passage tomb at Ardgill in Caithness, which must represent a secondary insertion into an ancient monument, probably around 2900, 2800 BC. While the arrowheads may have been imported from England, though there is clearly a debate about this, both they and the mace head point strongly towards Orkney, where both styles of artefact were used. The handful of other mace heads found in Highland includes this exquisite example, top left, of a Maesmawr-type mace head found from Sheridan's in Sutherland, found not a million miles away from another one found at Urquhart in Murray, the one on the left. You can also see the eponymous Welsh find here from Maesmawr, and the famous example from Nafin in the Boyne Valley. We don't know where these were made or from where the flint originated, but it's quite likely, given that an unfinished one was found in the Tay, and the style of the spirals on the Nauf example is reminiscent of Orcadian spirals, that they were made somewhere in Scotland. Were they made of Scottish flint? We don't know. That's a $4,000 question. And if we look more broadly at the distribution of mace heads, you can see the connection with Orkney, where many, many mace heads were made and used, including Christian mace heads. And you can see here a recent find of a heavily worn fragment of a Christian mace head that was found on Nick Beach. The goes for carved stone balls. You get a lot of them in Orkney. There's also here a link with Aberdeenshire, where the vast majority have been found. And thanks to the saintly Hugo Anderson Weimark, who he's just joined us recently, so he's our gain and Orkney's loss. He's now got a total of carved stone balls in Scotland up to 525 and growing. So just a scatter in Highland, but links north and south. Also, many of you will be familiar with the Highland Archaeology workshop in April this year, when Chris G from Orkney provided a masterclass in how to make these things. And knowing Chris, all of the ones that he made will have been marked so they don't confuse archaeologists in the future. This is a huge problem. An unexpected and very significant find a few years ago is this. Amazing. Stone bearing Grooved Ware type decoration found at Rue on Arisaig, spotted by the eagle-eyed Margaret MacDonald, built into the wall of Sheridan. You could lose this stone at Skara or at the Ness of Brodgar. And here is the stone in situ, built into a sort of Sheridan thing here. And it's now on display in Arisaig at the Land, Sea and Islands Centre. The find spot is very interesting in terms of the southwesterly spread of Grooved Ware and of stone and timber circle use from Orkney along the Atlantic facade around 3000 to 2900 BC. And if you look at the distribution of Grooved Ware, it seems that the contacts were actually along the western fringe of the Western Isles. How interesting. So they don't seem to have been sailing down the Minch. Or if they did, people didn't mark this by making Grooved Ware or doing stone circles. But Arisaig, if you remember where that was, if you're going to be sailing down and then back towards the mainland, Arisaig is one of the first places that you would come to when you get back. So, we have folks visiting Orkney from the southwest along the Atlantic facade, and also visiting Orkney from the southeast down the North Sea, and they rapidly adopted the paraphernalia that was associated with the hierarchical theocratic society that was flourishing there in Orkney. So, why don't we get the full Monty of Maesmawr-type passage tubes and Ness of Brodgar-type temple complexes in Highland? Almost certainly, because it was harder in Highland to accumulate the surplus, especially in cattle, that underpinned the astonishing process of competitive, conspicuous elite consumption that we see in Orkney. Also, the population was probably more dispersed. But that said, let's not forget, the construction in Highland several centuries earlier of the horn cairns would have required quite a surplus and a large workforce. So let's not underestimate the capacity of the land to support the accumulation of surpluses and the undertaking of large communal projects. Perhaps the good people of Caithness just had better taste than their vulgar names in Orkney. Discuss. And as for the end of the Neolithic, we do know, thanks to brand new DNA work that I'll be talking about in a few minutes, that more foreigners arrived during the third quarter of the third millennium BC. But it's less clear exactly how the Neolithic came to an end, and we're certainly not dealing with a massive influx of new people who killed everybody or gave everybody syphilis or whatever. So much for the whistle-stop tour through Highlands and Neolithic. What about the things that we don't know? Well, they are pretty numerous, actually. The most serious gap in our knowledge is geographical. There are large areas which have not been surveyed intensively. And you can see here the LiDAR coverage and the aerial photography coverage. And I thank Dave Cowley for letting me use these slides. And it's also a very long time since most of Highland was subjected to conventional field surveys by what was then the Royal Commission. So mostly done in the 1910s and 1920s with Skye, I think, 1984. Well, it's clear that we are unlikely to find very much in the mountainous areas that occupy much of the region. Nevertheless, the lowland fringes in the northwest of Sutherland remain very underexplored. The same is true of the islands. The Neolithic settlement evidence on Canna was found by chance when the National Trust were looking into rabbit scrapes. There was nothing on the surface that said there's going to be a settlement there. And the fact that so little arable cultivation is practiced nowadays in these remote areas means that chance finds are unlikely to come up very much. The second major gap in our knowledge is the shortage of settlement sites. Our knowledge record is dominated by funerary finds. Developer-funded and research excavation has shown us that it is out there, and it should be possible to do field feasible, and we can predict where, in valleys with chamber tombs, the settlements are likely to have been. Much knocking on doors to ask people if they've found anything is in order, I suspect. Similarly, there's a need to collate all of the information on stray finds of Neolithic artefacts in Highland, a pretty big task, but well worth doing. The third big gap concerns chronology. While we now have a growing number of high-quality dates, we are still a long way off from being able to say for certain when farmers first arrived in Highland, or what the sequence and tempo of passage tomb construction was, or exactly when the long-horn cairns and the short-horn cairns were built, although we do have more bones from the Loch Calder cairns that could be radiocarbon dated. We also need to refine our dating of Grooved Ware, but luckily that's what my Copies Between the Lines project is currently addressing. Then there are more specific questions. So according to the Highland HDR, there are 207 copper ringmark stones in Highland, including examples that were either made for or reused in various Cladh cairns. Tertia Barnett's current rock art project will provide a definitive record of all of these, and I thank her for letting me use her splendid distribution map. The dating of this rock art and how it's created fitted in with what we know about the Neolithic leaves a lot to be desired. Evidence from elsewhere, notably the area in and around Kilmartin Glen, makes it clear that it was being created well before it was reused during the early Bronze Age kists around 2200 BC, but how much earlier? The excavation through the Kilmartin Glacier suggests it could have been as early as 2800, and I'd put my money on 29 to 26 as being the main period of its creation. But it does not feature prominently in the Grooved Ware phenomenon, even though a few examples are present at the Maesmawr-type in Orkney. The problem with rock art is that it tends to get studied in isolation. We need to integrate it into our models, especially since the parallels between complex rock art in Breton and Ireland and that found in Galicia in northwest Iberia suggests a continuation of the long-distance Atlantic facade connections that had existed during the Middle and Late Neolithic. So, for example, the people who built the Boyne Valley Tube, the Newgrange and Alpine, went down to Brittany and they went down to Iberia. So, were people continuing to go down the Atlantic facade as far as Iberia? Possibly. But we can't integrate rock art into our model of Neolithic society before we have a better handle on its chronology. And for that, we need more explanation. Frustrating, as Donald Trump will tweet. And there are other specific questions, like setting aside the Cladh cairns with their stone circles, which Richard Bradley's work has shown were built after the Neolithic. What date are the other stone circles, and also the single standing stones in Highland? I'm thinking, for example, of the stone circles on Skye. Were these part of the flurry of Late Neolithic circle building around 3000 to 2900 BC that was inspired by the building of the stones of Stoness in Orkney? Or are they post-Neolithic? Again, more fieldwork needed. And, as Scott Timpany will confirm tomorrow, no doubt, there's a lot of the Palaeoenvironmental history that needs to get filled in, and sea level history. And in terms of material culture and contacts, there remains the question of how far north items of dark Yorkshire flint travelled. Hugo Anderson Weimark's work on the sources of flint in Orkney has cast doubt on the suggestion that Yorkshire flint made it as far north as Orkney, and has underlined the need for systematic raw material characterisation elsewhere in Scotland. And one obvious candidate is those oblique arrowheads from Orkney. Where were these wonderful Maesmawr-type maceheads made? And what was the impact of the Beaker immigrants? And when and how exactly did what we describe as the Neolithic come to an end? So, right, I think that's probably enough questions to pose for now. Time to discuss.